Well, I think we should remember the Human Rights Council is still a relatively young body. It's only been 3 years that it's been operating, and now for the first time in June they have the U.S. as a member. So that could make a difference. An Obama administration, a U.S. presence, that could be, I think, a positive influence on it. But we should have, I think, pretty realistic expectations. The Human Rights Council in some ways looks better than the earlier Human Rights Commission. In other ways, it actually has been a little bit worse. Any organ like that will attract a lot of the human rights violators who want to go there just to try to block any mention of themselves and their problems. So it's going to be a slow go. Well, I think we see in human rights something that really is a transatlantic bond. The U.S., the EU really have very similar values. I think the main difference is that the EU tends to stress a more multilateral approach, while the U.S. sometimes in its bilateral relationships with countries wants to stress human rights issues. But I think with the new Obama administration being more multilateral, more comfortable with international institutions than the George W. Bush administration had been, I think there are widening possibilities of working together, particularly just to strengthen the Human Rights Council, to look at particular problem countries and try to work together in those circumstances, and maybe look at some of their aid programs and look at some of the human rights values that should be stressed within those programs. So one hopes one can get more transatlantic coherence on these issues. I mean, the rhetoric, it's great that it coincides, but can we actually have action, actually operational policies where they come together and work together? That'll be the test. Well, we have to see with the Obama administration how far they'll go, because they're trying to stimulate the economy on the one hand and cut out excess programs on the other. So there's going to be great emphasis on the domestic economy. So even though I think they have goodwill towards foreign assistance, I think resources will be quite limited. And that could be, I think, a real issue. But I think there is a difference between the U.S. approach and the European approach. I think the Europeans have stressed more the amount of aid. The percentage of GDP that they're spending for foreign assistance as a real measure of how much they're doing. I think the U.S. has looked a little more at trade openness, and the issue of protectionism, particularly in European agriculture, is a very, very big issue. And there, I think the U.S. has probably made more progress on opening up to developing countries than Europe has. So I think, in a sense, they're talking past each other. One says, well, look, we're giving more aid. The other one says, yes, but we're doing more to open up. And I think one of the important things would be who really continues to invest in Africa, invest in some of the poorer countries in this difficult time, because it's nice to have government-to-government aid, but direct private investment can be extremely important in these kinds of situations, and there'd be a great temptation to pull back from what they see as high-risk countries. Well, I think one of the interesting things, for years and years we talk about reforming the UN, which is needed, and it's happening sort of incrementally, rather slowly. But at the same time, people are now recognizing that the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF in particular, they need some very significant reforms as well. And I think sort of the good news is that this makes the UN and the international financial institutions work together a bit more, recognizing they have similar concerns. And I think the World Bank in particular, but also the IMF, is beginning to understand they can't avoid politics altogether. They want to be somehow above politics, but security issues, question of mass human rights atrocities and violations, the nature of governance within societies, and also the nature of the neighborhood. They may be trying to focus on an individual country, but part of the problem in that country may be its neighbors, and both in economic terms and in political and security terms. So I think in some ways we're seeing a possibility now of looking at these issues in a more holistic way institutionally, not just trying to reform or change the UN or just the Bretton Woods institutions, but recognizing they're all part of the problem and hopefully will all be part of the solution. And so we have to look at it, I think, in a larger kind of context. Yeah, I don't follow it on a day-to-day basis, but I think generally one can say certain aggregate measures, at least until this recession, had a decent chance of being obtained, particularly because of the growth in India, China, and very large economies that were growing at a very rapid rate. But at the same time, the anomalies from one place to another are simply enormous. I mean, some places going backwards while others moving forwards very quickly. So the overall numbers look pretty good. But when you actually broke it down, there are pockets, particularly in Africa, but other parts of the world as well, that simply were stagnating. In some cases, we're moving backward a little bit. But I think one has to be very careful to disaggregate again and again. You know, even in Africa, there are real success stories, some places, real progress, overall growth rates not too bad. And yet at the same time, certain countries seem to be virtually basket cases or lack effective governance or are stuck year after year in civil strife and turmoil and war. And they simply can't move forward in that kind of a basis. So it's not simply regions we have to look at. We have to look at sub-regions. We have to look at individual countries within those. And I think at the end of the day, you see that the MDGs with very broad, grand goals are terrific, but it's really a mosaic, and the different pieces all look very different. And you put them all together, you get an overall picture, but that doesn't mean for your citizen in each country that they're necessarily doing well. I mean, there's a real question about inequality of income and opportunity within states. I think very importantly, the MDGs, focus on things like education, a question of gender equity, questions of water, quality of life kinds of issues, and not simply the question of how much money did you make this year, because it may be that the quantitative measures go up in some ways, and yet the basic quality of life isn't there, or they're not building the human capital for the future. Women aren't being educated, or you have a huge youth bulge with younger people who are not having the kinds of opportunity that they need. So, I think it's great that the MDGs are there. It's great that you have some big numbers and criteria to look at, but at the same time, they may be hiding as much as they tell us about what's actually going on in various places. And the responsibility to protect is something that's been accepted at the head of state and government level by all UN member states at the summit in 2005. And basically, the heads of state and government pledged that they would protect their populations, not just citizens, but all the people on their territory, from genocide, from war crimes, from ethnic cleansing, and from crimes against humanity. And that they would prevent those crimes from happening, and they would prevent the incitement of those crimes. This is a very important step forward because it recognizes that each state has this responsibility. It's not the right to protect the people, it's a responsibility, it's an obligation. It's part of the nature of sovereignty, of being an independent state, is in fact meeting the protection needs of one's citizens. That one doesn't have the right behind the veil of sovereignty to persecute and slaughter your own people. You can't go and pick and choose saying, well, certain people are not quite us. They're not citizens. They're from a different tribe, a different ethnicity, a different religion, whatever. You can't do that. It simply is not allowed. So I think in many ways what Responsibility to Protect has done, what we call R2P, is one, it builds on existing international law, existing human rights principles, but it looks at the very most egregious violations when there's mass violence against a portion of society. And it's simply saying, no, never again. And not only are we saying it, but we're determined to put in place a strategy, a doctrine, a plan, really operationalize this. Because in the past, with many of the human rights agreements and treaties, including the Genocide Convention, terrific documents, but no enforcement measures, no way of trying to operationalize them, no real strategy for going about it. So in many ways, what we're trying to do now is marry the various strengths of the UN system. It's quiet diplomacy, it's building of norms, it's gathering of states together to talk about things they may not want to talk about. It's an effort to look at everything from the good offices functions of the Secretary General to Chapter 7 and enforcement measures, whether they be military or economic or others, maybe even political pressures, to Chapter 8 of the Charter dealing with regional and sub-regional organizations. Really a recognition that this is everyone's business. You need the UN on the one hand, you need global norms and efforts, but you also need regional and sub-regional organizations. You need neighbors helping neighbors. Very importantly, in the African Union, for example, the old OAU, the Organization of African Unity, stressed non-interference. Borders were to be sacred. Now with the AU, the African Union, the emphasis is on non-indifference. We can't be indifferent to what happens in the neighborhood. If people are dying in huge numbers, as the case of Rwanda in the 1994 genocide, we don't have the right to look the other way. First and foremost, that state, those authorities have the responsibility for protecting the people on their territory. But they need the assistance, the support of the international community, and that's really the second pillar, and we have to find better ways of doing that. But third, if they're manifestly failing to protect the populations, we need to have ways of responding, and responding early, because traditionally people thought about humanitarian intervention. The idea was when the bodies pile up high enough, there'd be international outrage and outcry, and governments will finally take this seriously and they'll respond. And the assumption was normally this means a military incursion. To us, that simply, it's not good policy. One, because policy is keeping options open, having many ways of going about it. So we want to use a whole panoply of ways that the UN and its regional and sub-regional partners might respond, and civil society giving early warning to these kinds of things. Second of all, it simply is not morally acceptable to say we'll sit on our hands until the situation is out of control, and then the choice will be to respond. Because at that point, the costs would be very high, it'll be very difficult, the risks will be very high, member states will be reluctant to go in. So what we recognize, and the Secretary General says this very often now, is that we need an early and flexible response. Not late, not when the bodies pile up, but an early and flexible response, and tailored to the circumstances of each case. We can't have a cookie-cutter approach where one size fits all, because we know every situation is different. So we want to work with local authorities, we want to work with local NGOs and civil society groups, private sector. We want to work with the neighbors in a helpful way, because very often the neighbors are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And we recognize the UN doesn't have all the answers, but it is a place where international norms are created. And R2P is not a norm yet. It has no binding legal quality, but it has a certain normative character, and it affects values, it affects the way people think about things. And the other thing about R2P, it's a simple, straightforward concept. So I think it has great power politically. And I think people are coming to recognize that, and even in powerful capitals, they're coming to recognize that. But one of the things we think is very important but often overlooked is the emphasis on incitement. Because incitement is something you can often see or hear. And these mass violence, it doesn't just occur serendipity. It's planned in most cases. There's planning. They have to mobilize people. They have to get the information out. They have to get people to hate one another. And that is often political manipulation. So you can see that. And there are important cases in Cote d'Ivoire. Some years ago, Rwanda Mendez was a special advisor to the Secretary General for the Prevention of Genocide. Reports came out of Cote d'Ivoire. Many people thought it was the most likely place to have the next genocide, of incitement of one group against another. Very xenophobic kinds of tendencies are happening. So he went there very quietly, and he talked to the authorities, he talked to the president, he talked to others, and he said, look, what is happening now is very, very dangerous. Do you know the risks to your society, to your people, if you allow this to continue? You have to stop this. And they stopped it. Very quiet. It didn't get a lot of publicity. He didn't make a lot of headlines. The genocide never happened. We've seen a similar thing in Kenya. It didn't look like there was going to be a genocide after the elections that were so disputed in late 2007 and the violence into early 2008. But in fact, it looked like ethnic cleansing. There's one group against another, and one tribal group associated with one party or one candidate, and another the other. And some terrible things happened. Estimates vary. It may have been 800 people, it may have been 1,000 people killed, whatever. But it was getting to be mass violence, and more looked like it was coming. So again, Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, was there on a mission for the African Union trying to mediate with the parties. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon came over. They had the same message, which is you have to stop this incitement. This is not acceptable. Things are going to get out of control, and the international community won't allow it. And important, powerful countries like the US and groups like the EU made their own efforts. Countries in the region provided various people to mediate and try to bring the parties together. So many things are happening at once. But that was the one and only case where the UN has officially adopted R2P as the overarching strategy in Kenya. And what is important isn't that it changed everything that the UN did. It didn't change everything, but it gave them a goal. What are we trying to do? We're trying to stop genocide. We're trying to stop ethnic cleansing, trying to stop crimes against humanity. And that gives a focus to policy, gives a focus to the message, and one that is quite powerful. I mean, how can you argue against this? Oh, we're for ethnic cleansing, or we're for crimes against humanity, or God forbid we allow this to become a genocide. Countries understand these things are no longer acceptable. And to us, R2P, while it has a very good legal basis and foundation, is basically a political concept, and its power comes because it's so appealing to so many people in so many places. And we tend to think it's a northern concept, developed in the north. And what we're finding is actually the deepest roots are in Africa. And it comes from, in part, this idea of sovereignty as responsibility that Francis Deng and others developed in the 1990s. It's not basically based on humanitarian intervention, the idea of a military response. Instead, it's starting from the other side. It's a positive concept of what makes a society strong, what makes sovereignty work. It's when the authorities recognize that they have a fundamental responsibility. And where did states come from? Why were states formed to begin with? Largely for protection purposes. And so to say that, behind the closed door of sovereignty, when we can do anything to our people we want, turns that whole notion on its head. Because that's not why states were formed. It wasn't to abuse people. It was to protect people from other people and other states. And so, I think we have to recognize this as fundamental. I think the member states are beginning to understand this and beginning to accept this. Well, we have to recognize that R2P is not a miracle worker. It's a phrase, it's an idea, it's a concept. As I say, I think it has some political power, but you feel that over time. But I think even in a case like Darfur now, or the chaos in Somalia, or the much larger killing in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, people forget there was even greater killing in the war in the south in Sudan, much more than there has been in Darfur. But one, we have to realize that these things started before R2P really became a viable principle. The worst violence in Darfur, 2003. Some years ago, it wasn't until 2005 that the UN even adopted the principle of R2P, much less try to put it into action. But I think more importantly, we have to look at these as historical developments. These are dynamic situations. And what R2P contributes to is a change in the way people think about the responsibility of government, the purpose of government, their own individual responsibility. We talk about individual R2P. It's not just the state's responsibility. As individuals, we have a responsibility too. If we see something, to point out that in fact something is happening that's dangerous, to give early warning, to say certain things are unacceptable. And if you look back at the Rwanda Genocide in 1994, I mean, tragedy in many, many ways. One of the tragedies was that international institutions did not respond effectively. In the UN and the Security Council, big powers, the US among them, said, oh no, it's not a genocide, let's look the other way. There's a peace agreement, we should focus on the peace agreement. Let's not talk about this little violence that's happening. Well, of course, very soon it was mass violence of a horrible scale. But now I don't think people can look the other way anymore. In '94, in the UN system, even in the bureaucracy itself, people want to sort of ignore the reports that are coming out from Rwanda, really try to suppress them. Now, under Ban Ki-moon, the new Secretary General, it's quite the opposite. What he wants to hear about these things and hear about them early, because he doesn't want his watch at the UN tarnished the way that his predecessors was by this kind of mass violence. And it's important to remember that in the case of Rwanda and in the case of Srebrenica, with the murder of the 8,000 or so Muslims there, that they were both under the watch of UN peacekeepers. In both cases, a totally inadequate peacekeeping force, but they were there. Information was there, and policymakers preferred to look the other way. So what I think is changing, and I think even in Darfur we see this, is the international outcry, the concern about these tragedies that are unfolding, and a determination to do something. That doesn't mean that you have the answers. It doesn't mean the problems are easy to solve. Sudan, for example, is an enormous and very complicated country that's faced an ongoing civil war of one sort or another for many, many years. the rebel groups are divided. Some of them commit their own atrocities. You know, it's not like we have white hats and black hats and we easily separate them. It's a very complicated kind of a situation, a huge area, much of it inaccessible. And you'd have to have a very large, very mobile, very robust force to try to do it simply militarily. You've got to move the political pieces, you have to move the diplomatic pieces, you have to try to change societies through this. So we recognize that you know, we're just at the beginning of a long effort to make this an effective concept and really move it from simply being a promise into really being a practice. And we know it's not going to be an even road. Some places are going to do better than others. We know they're going to be stepped backwards some of the places. But we know if we keep pushing on this, that it is the wave of the future. It is something that more and more people in more and more parts of the world really care about. And what I find very satisfying going around the world is to discover all the things I didn't know about what people are doing in this area. You know, people say, well, Asia, there's no interest in R2P. You know, it's simply an African or maybe Latin American concept with a lot of European or North American support. I was amazed the first time I went to ASEAN to talk to people in Southeast Asia about this. For 6 years now, where they have the formal forum among the governments of ASEAN and Southeast Asia. There's a parallel civil society forum. And for 6 years now, even before there was any outcome document, any agreement at the UN about R2P, there was an R2P forum. And they're looking at ways to apply it to their own problems in the region. And so I think what we're discovering is this is actually a global phenomenon. And when we say in many ways southern issue that has all of a sudden been discovered by the North, there's actually a lot of truth to that. The AU Constitutive Act of 2000 has a clear paragraph 4H that has 3 of the 4 crimes. It doesn't have ethnic cleansing, it has the other 3, and it talks about the responsibility of the community to deal with these. You know, it can't be non-indifference anymore. We've got to focus on the real problems that exist there and not look the other way. Well, certainly Icc indictments, on the one hand, we cite them several times in the Secretary General's report as something that leaders, be they leaders of rebel groups or be leaders of governments, either way, if they're having these kinds of abuses under their watch, if they're encouraging this kind of violence against civilians, they have to realize impunity doesn't exist anymore. It's not only the ICC, but there are regional courts and tribunals as well. And they have to realize that times are changing and certain things are simply not acceptable anymore, and they might be held accountable. So on the one hand, we cite it. On the other hand, some member states are still complaining, so now wait a minute, the ICC is not a UN body. Why are you citing it? And certainly the warrant against a head of state, al-Bashir in Sudan, has complicated the politics of this. But I think at the end of the day, most people recognize that if you're ever going to get to a sense of rule of law, of a sense of predictability in these kinds of matters internationally, you're going to have some kinds of courts. You're going to have some kinds of investigations. And you know, we're also looking at things like peer review mechanisms, where states look at other states and how are they doing. Sometimes these work, sometimes they don't. But even if they don't, we're looking in a more positive way at best and good practices. You know, what are some states doing that have been through these kinds of traumas that could be lessons for other states in other parts of the world, or even in their own neighborhood? What are some of the regional and sub-regional organizations doing that we might not know about? Some of the civil society networks around the world, we need to know more how they work and how we can tap into their information. So there's a lot of work to be done here. But I think the important thing is that the direction now, I think politically, is like a rising tide. It's rising slowly, but it's beginning to rise when for many years it looked like it was ebbing and simply wasn't going to come back. And I'm very confident that whether we make a big difference with the report and the efforts by the Secretary General now, I think we are moving in the right direction. But even if we don't, I think we're sort of providing some guideposts for others who come along after this. And I'm very confident that where 10 or 20 years ago people paid very little attention to these things, 10 or 20 years from now, they have some pretty effective mechanisms to deal with this. And I think we'll see, and there's some indications we're already beginning to see this, that the incidence of genocide or mass violence, in fact, is going down. And we want to encourage that, and we want to push that. And we think that's the wave of the future.